Around the year 1250, the word scab was first recorded, referring to diseases of the skin. It's fairly easy to see why we use the same word for dried, crusty chunks of childhood wounds. They're both gross skin things. But sometime in the 1500s, England adopted scab to refer to people who are dishonest, unscrupulous, bums, and low-life ruffians. To call someone a scab wasn't just rude or a basic your mama joke. It was the mother of all insults. The triple dog dare from A Christmas Story type of insult. That personal affront became the segue from diseased skin to diseased person. In the late 1700s, a scab became a person who didn't join a labor union or who didn't participate in a strike. Labor unions are associations of workers created to protect workers' rights. The general purposes of labor unions are to negotiate and enforce contracts for better working conditions, fair wages, affordable health care, job security, and reasonable hours. A fee, or union dues, is collected by members to be used to fund programs, staff, and a variety of other activities for the betterment of the members. When a serious problem arises with workers' rights, the ultimate weapon is a strike, the collective refusal of employees to work under the current conditions. If someone doesn't join in the strike, it can be devastating for everyone else. That person is a scab. So if you think about the word scab having a history of meaning filthy, lowly, despicable, something worth fighting over if someone called you that, that's the feeling of disgust and loathing attributed to a labor union scab, the lowest of low, the disease of a group. In 1777, in Bonner and Middleton's Bristol Journal, it was written, "The conflict between labor and capital would not have been so sharp had there not been so many dirty scabs." In 1905, Jack London said of scabs,
"He who takes from another man's purse takes from his existence. To strike at a man's food and shelter is to strike at his life. It is for this reason that a laborer is so fiercely hostile to another laborer who offers to work for less pay or longer hours. Just as the peaceful country dweller calls the sea rover a pirate, the striking laborer applies the opprobrious epithet scab to the laborer who takes from him food and shelter."
So inspired by his loathing of scabs, Jack London wrote
Ode to a Scab, saying, "After God had finished the rattlesnake, the toad, and the vampire, he had some awful substance left with which he made a scab. Where others have hearts, he carries a tumor of rotten principles. When a scab comes down the street, men turn their backs and angels weep in heaven, and the devil shuts the gates of hell to keep him out. Judas Iscariot was a gentleman compared with the scab. Esau sold his birthright for a mess of pottage. Judas Iscariot sold his Savior for 30 pieces of silver. Benedict Arnold sold his country for a promise of a commission in the British Army. The modern strikebreaker sells his birthright, his country, his wife, his children, and his fellow men for an unfulfilled promise from his employer, trust, or corporation. Solidarity wins."
The first documented employment strike in the newly formed United States of America was in 1786. Dealing with long hours and low wages, the ultimate affront came when the economy had taken a turn for the better, and the cost of living went down. Basically the opposite of what we have today. Where normally that would have been an ideal situation, printers in Philadelphia got a raw deal. Their employers reduced their pay. Printers had been making $6 per week, or $1 per day. But when the cost of living lowered, their pay was also lowered to $4.33 per week, a 28% drop in wages for the same work. Today, that would be like making $100 per day, reduced to $72. Definitely a big drop. Employers greatly benefited from better prices and paying less for labor. That did not go over well with the workers. So on May 31st, 1786, printers gathered. They all refused to work until their wages were returned to $6 per week. The strike lasted 10 days, successfully ending on June 10th, with the return to their original fair wage. The key to the strike's success was that there were no scabs. There were no additional workers who swooped in to take the place of the workers who were on strike. The companies had no choice but to give in. Had scabs, or strikebreakers, shown up to do the work, the purpose would have been undermined, the strike would have failed, and, likely, the striking printers would have lost their jobs. James Riddle Hoffa was born on Valentine's Day in 1913. His father was a coal miner in Indiana who passed away in 1920 from lung disease. It was a terrible, albeit common, side effect of the conditions in coal mines. Little Jimmy was 7 when his father died. His siblings were 10, 9, and 6 years old. His mom worked as a radiator cap polisher to support her young children, but they inevitably lived in poverty. 4 years later, in 1924, the struggling family moved from Brazil, Indiana, to Detroit, Michigan. To help his mother with basic bills, Jimmy began working at 14, taking on odd laborer jobs as they came available. He worked for several years as a stockboy and warehouseman. In 1930, when he was 17, Jimmy got a job working as a freight handler for the Kroger grocery store chain. The wages were low. They were paid only 32 cents per hour. Today, that would be $5.68 per hour. As freight handlers, they were either unloading trucks or they were waiting for the next truck to come in. They were required to be on the job, ready to work at 4:30 a.m. and work 12-hour shifts. However, they were not paid for that time they spent waiting for the next truck to unload. They could be left waiting around for hours without pay. Furthermore, and I'm not sure how this was enforced, they were required to spend 3/4 of their earnings at Kroger's stores. Upset by Kroger's unfair wages, working conditions, and lack of job security, Jimmy helped organize a workers' strike. He was young, but he'd already been a laborer for several years. The strike was planned for precisely when a large shipment of fresh strawberries arrived. Store management knew that the strawberries would spoil quickly if they weren't unloaded and immediately put on ice. They got the message of the strike loud and clear. Management heard the demands, and Jimmy led negotiations for fair working conditions. New contracts were made within the hour. Again, had there been scabs, the strike would have been devastating for all of the workers. But Jimmy's convincing speeches rallied everyone to work together. His peers were naturally impressed by the gutsy 17-year-old, and Jimmy became their unofficial group leader. In 1932, Jimmy quit working for Kroger's grocery stores after refusing to work for an abusive foreman. Having developed a reputation for demanding fair work laborers, Jimmy was invited to join the local chapter of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. His fellow workers who'd gone on strike with him, the so-called Strawberry Boys, also joined the Teamsters. Officially founded in 1903, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters was a result of a merger of the Team Drivers and the Teamsters National Union. According to their website, teamster.org, the IBT, better known as the Teamsters, is America's largest, most diverse union. The Teamsters are known as the champion of freight drivers and warehouse workers, but have organized workers in virtually every occupation imaginable, both professional and non-professional, private sector and public sector. Teamsters stand ready to organize workers who want to bargain collectively. Once a contract is negotiated and signed, the union works to enforce it, holding management's feet to the fire and invoking contract grievance procedures if management chooses not to. Wages and benefits under Teamster contracts are markedly better than those of non-union employees in similar jobs. Teamster contracts are the guarantors of decent wages, fair promotion, health coverage, job security, paid time off, and retirement income. For more than a century, the Teamsters have been a public voice for the rights and aspirations of working men and women and a key player in securing them. Jimmy joined the Teamsters in 1933 when he was about 20 years old. It was a natural fit for Jimmy, and he easily used his experience and his charisma to recruit new members. He was a large part of organizing strikes and boycotts, if there was a need, for everyday workers. Successful union activities in one company were known to effect similar changes in other companies when they saw a potential strike in their company's future. Jimmy worked with other union leaders to turn local union trucker groups into regional groups and then into a national group. James Neff, author of Vendetta, Bobby Kennedy vs. Jimmy Hoffa, said, "In Detroit in the 1930s, the nickname, particularly in that city, was the Bloody Thirties. They would battle it out with sticks and chains, and one day, Hoffa was arrested, I believe it was 17 times. They grabbed him at a picket line, throw him in jail. He'd get bonded out, and he'd go right back to the picket line and end up in jail." When Jimmy joined the union, the Teamsters were about 75,000 strong. In his first 3 years, their membership grew 126%. And in the next 3 years, it grew an additional 147%, making the membership 420,000 by 1936. That same year, Jimmy attended a non-unionized strike of laundry workers in Bowling Green, Ohio. He met his future wife at that strike, 18-year-old Josephine, and the two married months later. They went on to have 2 children, Barbara and James. In 1937, Jimmy was elected to be president of his local union in Detroit, Michigan. He spoke easily with everyday workers. He was one of them, and his relatable personality made his popularity amongst laborers inevitable. People loved this guy. Jimmy quickly showed his persuasive abilities when he turned that small union from a 40-member unit with $400 into a 5,000-member unit with $50,000. The Teamsters quickly became one of the most powerful unions in the United States. Keep in mind that the point at which Jimmy Hoffa became heavily involved in union activity was in the 1930s, so this was not an easy time to dive headfirst into workers' rights. 1933 was the height of the Great Depression. The banking system had collapsed. Money supply was 40% lower than the stock market crash of 1929. 4,000 banks and 1,700 savings and loans failed. Upwards of 50% of all home mortgages were in default, which led to a flood of foreclosures, many of which included farms. Factories were shut down. Mills and mines became ghost towns. Nearly 13 million people were left jobless. The unemployment rate was 25%. For comparison, the current unemployment rate is about 3.6%. Prices and productivity had fallen by 1/3, which led to lower incomes. For those who were able to keep their jobs, many had their wages reduced up to 42%. As if the Great Depression wasn't bad enough, another catastrophic event was ongoing. The Dust Bowl, which had started in the Oklahoma Panhandle, had ravished 100 million acres of land, leading to more than 500,000 people left homeless. The intense drought and severe soil erosion from overprocessing wheat created black dust storms so great that 10 states between Canada and Texas were affected. Many people developed long-term coughs, and some died of dust pneumonia or malnutrition because no crops grew. The country was in a state of distress. Hunger was at the forefront of everyone's mind. Desperation was seen everywhere. In an attempt to pull the country out of the Depression, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was passed. Its purpose was to raise tariffs on imported items, essentially making it too expensive to buy imported products. The theory was that Americans buying only American products would keep the revenue inside the country. The problem was that Europe retaliated. They too raised their tariffs, making American-made goods too expensive to buy, which lowered exporting, which lowered revenue from exporting, which made the Depression worse. If you take a step back from the messy leadership in the 1930s, I don't think it's difficult to see why there was also political desperation. The government was chasing its own shadow, trying to figure out how to fix the failing country. People were literally starving, and criminals were doing better. It was impossible to immediately fix the economy, create jobs, repair the land ruined in the Dust Bowl, start farming again, etc. But one thing could visibly change, which could lend some credit to government agencies and maybe cause the public to look positively upon the government. They could go after criminals, real or perceived. Perhaps they could improve their reputation of having things under control if the public saw something being fixed. Al Capone became an organized crime boss during Prohibition, which outlawed alcohol in 1920 and continued to the height of the Great Depression. Prohibition, which was implemented to reduce crime and corruption, allowed Capone to gain wealth and status as a bootleg alcohol smuggler from connections in Canada. Those who refused to purchase the alcohol from Capone's crew were often treated with a special gift involving combustion and explosion of their establishments. With politicians and law enforcement in his pocket, he was able to keep the general stream of illegal hooch flowing for years. They simply looked the other way when rough justice was used. But considered enemy number one, government officials used tax law to take him down in 1932. John Dillinger led the Dillinger Gang in 1933 and 34. They were accused of robbing 24 banks and 4 police stations, jailbreaks, and a spree of much worse. It was his gang's action that led to J. Edgar Hoover turning the Bureau of Investigation to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in an attempt to have better resources to fight organized crime. At the height of the Great Depression, and in the time considered the Public Enemy era, the Barrow Gang made their mark as well. The gang from which Bonnie and Clyde got their infamy were a crew of outlaw robbers and general criminals between 1931 and 1934 until they were caught, ending in a shootout. The Barker-Karpus Gang, more often known as Ma Barker's Gang, had around 25 members between 1931 to 1935. Considered more ruthless than other criminal gangs, they robbed banks, dabbled in kidnapping, and had no problem removing problems in human form if they got in the way. They too were caught, ending in a shootout. Surviving the 1930s was practically preparation for surviving the 1940s. Only 2 years since recovery from the decade-long Great Depression, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the country changed again. There was hardly enough time to take a deep breath before World War II arrived. Just as so many were drafted or voluntarily enlisted for the war, the Teamsters also jumped in to help. The general president of the Teamsters, Dan Tobin, asked that labor unions put all other issues aside and focus only on how to aid in the war. Teamsters and other laborers were able to not only enlist to serve, they put their knowledge of vehicles to use both warfront and in the States. Perhaps the biggest change and pledge of unions was that there were to be absolutely no strikes or work stoppage as long as there was war. Tobin said,
"A man who quits work now without the consent and approval of his union, which he cannot get, is and should be and will be classed as an enemy of our nation and of our government."
Teamsters took on the task to advocate for lending to the government via war bonds. Unions raised over $2 million in war bonds in the first 18 months of the war. Further, the Teamsters offered an interest-free loan of $8 million. President Roosevelt declined the proposal, but responded to Dan Tobin,
"Your offer should be an example to the whole country."
Tobin said,
"We weren't fooling when we told President Roosevelt that all of our assets were behind the government in the war. The Teamsters are supplying men and money to the limit of their resources."
By 1942, 125,000 Teamsters were in military operations, including those who were highly skilled to drive troops to the front lines. After the war, the Teamsters rallied around their veteran union members. They made sure that members who returned from the war kept their previous seniority when they returned to work. They further encouraged companies and individuals to use their freight and delivery services, putting truckers back to work in a decade-long campaign called Have It Delivered. But when it comes to Jimmy, it's very difficult to find out what he was actually doing in the 1940s. What we do know is that he did not serve in the war. He obtained a deferment from military service, making the case that his skills would be more valuable on the home front by keeping freight running smoothly. Other than war efforts, Jimmy was definitely a union guy in the 1940s. He fought alongside everyday workers. Outside of that, simple research into Jimmy Hoffa returns essentially this: Jimmy Hoffa was corrupt. Jimmy Hoffa was working with the mafia. Or, as Wikipedia says, for Hoffa to unify and expand trucking unions, he had to make accommodations and arrangements with many gangsters. Organized crime influence on the IBT increased as the union itself grew. And then we're supposed to move on to the next decade of Jimmy's life without evidence of this absolute corruption. That's it. He was shady and corrupt. The end. Undoubtedly, Jimmy and other union members had at least some interactions with mafia members. So did, politicians. I'm unsure, however, how that creates a Jimmy who we should write off as crooked to the core. In 1952, Jimmy became the national vice president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters under newly elected Teamster president Dave Beck. That same year, Robert "Bobby" Kennedy was appointed assistant counsel for the Committee on Government Operations. He was appointed by the chairman, Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy, the man who cried wolf, communism, who used fabricated information and smear tactics to prove that fill-in-the-blank was actually a communist or a Soviet spy. In 1956, allegations were made that Teamster leadership was involved in illegal activities. Who made those allegations? I don't know, but I have a hunch that it rhymes with Tobby Schmenedy. The Select Committee on Labor, of which Bobby Kennedy was chief counsel, was told to collect financial information to investigate those allegations. Known to be far less than neutral on the subject of labor unions, Bobby was given extensive control over investigation, questioning witnesses, and scheduling testimony. The committee found that Teamster President Dave Beck had taken over $85,000, nearly $1 million today, from the union's funds to pay personal bills, and that a builder had been paid $196,000, $2 million today, from union funds to work on his home. He was convicted of fraud and sent to prison. Jimmy was made general president in 1957. Predictably, Bobby Kennedy then turned his attention to Jimmy Hoffa. He claimed that Jimmy misappropriated nearly $10 million of union funds and that he was making corrupt deals with employers. Bobby questioned Jimmy as a part of the Select Committee on Labor. It was widely recognized that Bobby was absolutely awful, an unskilled litigator, stumbly and inept. Jimmy, however, came out of the hearing a bolstered hero of the people.
His ties with the leading members of the Communist Party in the world, and the fact that Mr. Goldblatt is identified continuously and repeatedly as an important member of the Communist Party, and he's the Secretary-Treasurer of this local with whom you've made this alliance?
I don't know if Harry Bridges is a Democrat or a communist, or whether Goldblatt's a communist, and this is not the issue behind the question of transportation unity. The workers have so elected them under the free democratic rights of America and under the Taft-Hartley law. And they have filed for 10 years, according to Goldblatt's testimony, non-communist affidavits.
All right, would you allow...
If you think it's wrong, you investigate that.
Would you allow, as a Teamster official, a man who was a communist, who was elected by the membership?
We don't have any communists in our Teamsters. Just a moment, please, that I know of. But if the membership saw fit to elect a man who had been tagged, mind you, as a communist, who disavowed the fact that he was a communist, and no proof was presented, under our Constitution of the International Union, we would not be in a position to dislodge him from his elected position. Neither would the courts let us do it. However, the provision you're looking for in our Constitution is very clear. And it talks about the question of communism, and I helped write the article, so I know it. You don't need to read it to me.
Right.
And I say to you, though, that I'm talking about tagged individuals, and Bridges and Goldblatt are tagged.
Oh, Mr. Hoffa.
Tagged.
What do you mean? There's no question about Mr. Goldblatt, although there can be a question about Mr. Hoffa. There's no question about Mr. Goldblatt.
Oh, wait a minute, just a moment. Don't say anything about a question about Hoffa. There is no question about Hoffa, and don't you say that either. Don't you say that I'm a communist, or even affiliated with one. You said that enough around this country, and I want the American press to know that I resent the fact that there is any inference that I'm a communist, that I'm associated with or controlled by communists, and don't use this as a sounding board for headlines for that purpose. And I appeal to the chair that that be taken out of the record, and that nobody cast any aspersions on my loyalty to this country.
Just a moment.
I object to it, sir.
At the moment. Read back.
Well, I'll straighten the record out. I was talking about Mr. Bridges and Mr. Goldblatt.
Well, don't put me in their class, then.
Why did you put him in there, Kleinman?
No, I just said although there might be some question, and I said Mr. Hoffa instead of Mr. Bridges. I meant, although there might be some question about Mr. Bridges, there is absolutely no question about Mr. Goldblatt. And evidently you agree the same thing, Mr. Hoffa. Wait a minute. Or otherwise you wouldn't have said, don't put me in their class.
Don't you put me in a class that they're tagged. That's what I said. And I say tagged. But I want to have, if you will, sir, the record clear that there are no aspersions on me being associated with, controlled, or any part of the Communist Party in America.
You had been in business with Mr. Matheson, had you not?
With my own money.
Yeah, but you had been in business.
With my own money, yes.
Do you have any evidence of the $20,000 in cash that you put into the business?
I don't need any evidence. You'll take my word for it, as the Internal Revenue has.
Could you describe a little of it, Mr. Hoffa?
No, sir, I cannot, and I don't care to try and recall back my entire lifetime since I started working at the age 17 as to how I accumulated money or how I spent it to finally arrive at having $20,000 I could afford to invest and finally lost. Thank you for reviewing the testimony.
Does it suggest anything to you, Mr. Hoffa?
Doesn't suggest anything except the fact that you're trying again, as you have many times in this hearing, to bring a headline about or to embarrass Hoffa. That's all.
It's extremely difficult because you do deal in cash.
And I'm going to continue.
And you're going to what? I didn't hear the end.
I'm going to continue, sir.
Well, I think that's an interesting way to conduct your affairs as the head of a large union.
I think it's an American way.
You deal in cash?
Any way you have, as long as it's money that is subject to being able to put into trade and is paid income tax on as gainfully earned.
Jimmy was charged and found not guilty. But now the Teamsters had 2 large investigations, and though Jimmy was found innocent, his name was associated with corruption. A group was created when Jimmy became the Teamsters president. It was called the United States Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, which was, thank goodness, better known as the McClellan Committee. Meanwhile, Jimmy wanted an active, educated working class and understood the importance of political activity. In 1959, he developed the DRIVE Project, Democratic, Republican, Independent Voter Education. His goal was not to have union members affiliate with one party or another. His aim was to encourage general activism, to be heard as a working class people, not to pander to one political party. Who wouldn't want that? Oh yeah, politicians. Bobby Kennedy could not accept that Jimmy was simply not guilty of corruption. When Big Brother John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, he appointed little brother Bobby to be Attorney General. Thereafter, Bobby continued his quest, or maybe obsession, to essentially catch Jimmy. In 1960, Jimmy was re-elected as general president of the Teamsters. Those around him knew him as a fighter for workers, a tough, charismatic friend of the everyday guys. During the presidential campaign between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, Jimmy was an open supporter of Nixon, so that wasn't going to go over well with the Kennedys. Bobby sent Jimmy a copy of his book, called The Enemy Within. Inside, he wrote a note. To Jimmy, I'm sending you this book so you won't have to use union funds to buy one. Bobby. Between the years of 1960 and 1964, it's once again difficult to find out exactly what happened in Jimmy's life. Different sources go from discussing Jimmy's union activities and his beloved by the people status to then declaring that Jimmy's a criminal. The end. In 1964, Bobby Kennedy was laser-focused on Jimmy. His view was that Jimmy used threats to bully employers for personal profit. A group of 20 from the Justice Department made up of investigators and lawyers were teamed up. They were called the Get Hoffa Squad. The problem was that it was pretty clear that the moves that Bobby made fell outside of what is appropriate for the Attorney General. Jimmy was aggressively pursued by a whole squad without a drop of evidence. Speculation? Yes. Theories? Definitely. But no proof could be submitted prior to the investigation. Many believed that Bobby's actions were born of a vendetta and spite, more than to truly catch a criminal. During that time, Jimmy openly said that he was a victim of illegal surveillance and that government workers were being paid to commit perjury in their accusations against him. As Bobby continued to pursue Jimmy, union efforts continued. In 1964, Jimmy's attorney was arrested and convicted of trying to bribe a police officer. But that same year, Jimmy successfully brought in nearly all North American truck drivers under a single contract. The National Master Freight Agreement, uniting 400,000 truckers. Congressman Elmer Holland said,
Jimmy Hoffa has put more bread and butter on the tables for American kids than all his detractors put together.
Jimmy said,
While working men and women have long known the value of $1, it is less well taught to one who labors for a living. It has taken a long, long time to teach employers the value of a human being, and in many cases has not yet been successfully taught. Few give thought to what happens to displaced workers, but they can analyze to the penny what the profits will be.
Jimmy supported Martin Luther King Jr. and other anti-segregation activists years before they ever gained national attention. Even if he was faced with losing campaigns in the South, Jimmy refused to participate in or affiliate with segregated unions.
If they want segregation, we don't want them. We pride ourselves in the fact that there are no Jim Crow locals in our union.
In 1965, Jimmy donated $25,000 to Martin Luther King Jr. In a letter he penned to Jimmy, King said,
Were it not for dedicated friends, such as yourself, our work would not be able to continue. I am sure America will be a greater nation because of your sacrifice to the nonviolent movement.
As King preached for nonviolent protests, Jimmy preached a similar stance for laborers. He said,
Organize some more. It is the way that we can show the powers that be that they are not going to take away our wages, hours, and benefits. Our voice will be too loud and too strong to ignore.
Jimmy's voice drew laborers to him. His actions kept them there. Even when he was at the peak of his career, Jimmy never lost sight of where he came from and why he was committed to working-class families. He was well aware that his own father's death was due to the working conditions he and so many other coal miners experienced. His mother worked hard for Jimmy and his siblings, and he never forgot the poor working conditions he dealt with when he began working at only 14 years old. The disdain between Bobby Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa grew. Jimmy intentionally spelled Bobby wrong, as Bobbie, to feminize him and to get under his skin. Bobby continued to put everything he could toward a Jimmy conviction. Though he'd been accused of many things which were never proven, Bobby threw enough spaghetti at the wall and some of it stuck. Jimmy was convicted on 2 counts of tampering with a jury in a conspiracy trial 5 years earlier, and was sentenced to 8 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. He appealed. Of that conviction, Jimmy said,
If this is justice in the United States, then I pity those who haven't the money to pay for an appeal, because this is a railroad job in my opinion.
While out on bail during the appeal, a second federal court convicted Jimmy of 1 count of conspiracy and 3 counts of mail and wire fraud, with a sentence of 5 years. Now, I'm not going to say that crime is no big deal as long as it's not that bad, but those convictions seem awfully weak for the length of time, money, and resources spent over many years by committees and the Get Hoffa squad. If Jimmy was as big of a criminal as career politicians wanted him to be, shouldn't they have uncovered much, much more than a 5-year-old jury tampering, general conspiracy, and mail fraud? He'd been a target for years, and that's what they ended with? Wow, Bobby, pretty hardcore. Though if you look at the website for Robert Kennedy, rfkhumanrights.org, you'll get a much more impressive view. His later work as chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee, investigating corruption in trade unions, won him national recognition for his investigations of Teamsters union leaders Jimmy Hoffa and David Beck. Less than 5 years into his sentence, Jimmy was released from prison. It is widely said that he was pardoned, but that's not the case. President Richard Nixon commuted his sentence to time served. But there was a caveat that he would not engage in the direct or indirect management of any labor organization until what would have been the end of his original prison sentence, March 6, 1980. Jimmy said he never agreed to that restriction and sued to invalidate it, but unsurprisingly, he lost. John Dean was the one who drafted the release clause under President Nixon's request. John Dean was also in the lead role in coordinating the cover-up of Watergate. He cooperated with Senate investigators into Watergate while he continued to work as Nixon's chief White House counsel, giving legal advice. Clearly, he was a man of strong moral values. John Dean pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, admitted to supervising the hush money payments to the Watergate burglars, and revealed the existence of Nixon's enemies list. For his felonious actions, he served an intense, excruciating 4 months in what was essentially a safe house where witnesses are protected from the mafia. During that time, he spent his days throwing others under the bus, testifying about other Watergate conspirators. A result of those discussions was convictions of multiple people. Dean was disbarred when he was released, and he went on with his life, inserting himself into a circus tent worth of political drama, even to this day. I'll finish this part by asserting that I'd be incredibly cautious of whatever John Dean's stance is on just about anything. Anyway, he's the one who said that Nixon told him to draft Jimmy's early prison release. So Bobby and a herd of people worked for years to get Jimmy behind bars. What was the purpose of releasing Jimmy early? Maybe the prison guards couldn't figure out how to turn off the cameras like they did for Epstein. Sorry, too soon? After his release, though he was barred from it, it said just about everywhere that Jimmy wanted to return to union activity, but that the mafia was aggressively opposed to that. Why? They didn't want him involved in unions. The mafia, who Jimmy supposedly colluded with throughout his career, and with whom he conspired and delved into the deepest pit of corruption, well, obviously they changed their minds once Jimmy was a convicted criminal. The mafia has standards, people. They don't run with felons. Wednesday, July 30th, 1975. Jimmy left his home in his green Pontiac. He supposedly said that he had an appointment at 2 p.m. to meet two mafia members known as Tony Jack and Tony Pro at a restaurant in Detroit. A little after 2, Jimmy called home to tell his wife they hadn't shown up. When he didn't return home, his wife reported him missing. His car was found at the restaurant. It's said that the last person who saw Jimmy was a truck driver, which is ironic considering his lifelong work for truckers. The driver said that he saw Jimmy in a car with multiple men when their car nearly crashed into his truck as they left the restaurant. He has never been seen again. The two Tonys said that they had no appointment to meet with Jimmy, that they didn't see him that day, and that in fact they hadn't seen him in years. The New York Times reported this. Daniel Sullivan, a former business agent of Teamsters who provided witnesses for Senate investigations into Teamster corruption in the 1950s, was the first person, by name, to come forward and link threats by Tony Pro with Mr. Hoffa's union politics. Mr. Sullivan said in a telephone interview that Mr. Hoffa told him that Tony Pro threatened, in Mr. Hoffa's words, to pull out my guts or kidnap my grandchildren. Recap. Daniel said Jimmy said that Tony said that he'd pull out Jimmy's guts or kidnap his grandkids. Mr. Sullivan's story of what Mr. Hoffa said runs counter to Tony Pro's account. Tony Pro said that he had not had any contact with Mr. Hoffa in more than 4 years. Mr. Sullivan originally was an anti-Hoffa, rank-and-file man in the Teamsters Union, who was one of 13 dissidents who successfully petitioned federal court to put the union under federal monitors. He was attempting to continue his battle against corruption, and he had begun to view Mr. Hoffa as a potential ally. Recap. Daniel went to federal court to put the Teamsters under surveillance because he was anti-Jimmy. Daniel was continuing to fight corruption and now saw Jimmy as an ally. I realize that I tend toward disbelief of a long-repeated story, that I question the stories we're supposed to accept simply because it's repeated ad nauseum. But this just doesn't make sense. It feels nearly offensive to have this be the accepted narrative. Let's review the story we're supposed to believe. Jimmy was a union leader who climbed the career ladder due to his involvement with the mafia. When he was finally arrested after many years of a literal Get Hoffa squad run by Bobby Kennedy, the mafia then hated him once he was behind bars. Jimmy's let out of prison early by the self-confessed, convicted master conspirator in President Nixon's Watergate scandal. He's told he cannot be part of unions anymore. He wants to get back into union activity, so he goes to Tony Pro, his former friend but now sworn enemy, to ask for help to get back into union work. Tony Pro gets so angry he said he'd have Jimmy's guts ripped out and kidnap his grandkids. The guy who supplied witnesses to testify against Jimmy in the Senate hearings, self-declared anti-Jimmy, told authorities that Jimmy had made the mafia mad, and that he, personally, saw Jimmy as an ally now. Thus, the mafia clearly disappeared Jimmy. The case speaks for itself. The end. Jimmy was declared deceased in 1982. In 2001, a strand of hair was found in the car that was believed to have been the last car in which Jimmy was seen. It was tested and identified as Jimmy's. A single strand of hair with DNA 26 years after he went missing. That seems perfectly normal and not at all staged. Since 1975, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance has been one of the most speculated cases. His body has been searched for in places such as a horse farm in Michigan, under a garage, a golf course, fields in Detroit, the Everglades, an old Giant stadium, Japan. As recently as June 2022, the FBI searched under the Pulaski Highway in New Jersey. They acted on a tip that Jimmy was stuffed into a steel drum and buried there. He wasn't.
Hell, I had people try to kill me. I survived it. Didn't have no bodyguard, but I survived the threat of being killed, an attempt to be killed. I'm still here. Because I keep my eyes open, drive my own car, go where I want to go, never need a bodyguard. I don't cheat nobody, I don't lie about nobody, I don't frame nobody. And if I don't, and I don't talk bad about people. If I do, I tell them. So what the hell's people going to try to kill me for? Get you out of the way. Ah, that's nonsense. Out of the way for what?
What happened to Jimmy Hoffa? I see three options. Option 1. The Mafia. In order for this to make sense, according to popular belief, we have to believe that Jimmy held hands with the Mafia from around 1933 to about 1967. Organized crime had really developed a strong backbone during those really rough years, which means they were, as the name says, organized. I don't think anyone believes that strategic criminals were in it for much more than money and power. Law enforcement went full force into bringing down criminals like Al Capone, while Jimmy went full force into fair wages for average laborers. For years, decades, Jimmy denounces mafia affiliation, becomes enraged at the hint of being called a communist, refuses to affiliate with racial segregationists, and is adored by union members and basically regular people. When he was heavily investigated for many years, he was arrested for pitifully small charges, and the president commuted his sentence. But during that short sentence, the mafia decided they hate him. This enormous, secretive organization, the mafia, who used phrases like, "I heard you paint houses," and "I'm also a carpenter." That same group, who invested and profited in Jimmy's role in the Teamsters for so many years, they had a main guy tell Jimmy, "I'll pull out your guts and kidnap your grandkids," because he asked for help to get back in the same organization that made them money. Is it me, or does that sound more like a mafia movie than an actual organized mafia? And somehow it bothers me that the two Tonys who were said to be with Jimmy on July 30th said they hadn't seen him in years. I feel like mafia members who hold actual power and likely some ego would say, "Yeah, I saw him, what about it?" Maybe it's just me. But why would the mafia take Jimmy out? I don't know. Maybe they heard the good news and turned to Jesus, but they had one last bad deed to handle first. Option 2. The government. We're not supposed to think this one. We're just not. We're not supposed to think that Bobby Kennedy was trying to make a name for himself as the younger bro of dearly loved JFK. We're not supposed to pay attention to Bobby working with communist-obsessed McCarthy. We're not supposed to remember that it was a lengthy, in-depth investigation that finally got Jimmy arrested, after multiple failed attempts. We shouldn't care that serious money and power were used, and all they came up with was a 5-year-old accusation of jury tampering. We're not supposed to acknowledge that once someone has been arrested and deemed legally criminal, it's easier to arrest them on additional charges. We should ignore that less than 5 years into his sentence, John Dean confessed, convicted conspirator penned Jimmy's release. Why would anyone in government take out Jimmy? I don't know. Maybe the Kennedys had their own sworn enemies list like Nixon did. All I do know is that Jimmy's disappearance had nothing at all to do with government wrongdoing. Absolutely not. No. I love politicians. The government is uncorruptible, and that's that. Period. Option 3. Someone else. If we really don't know what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, how do we know that some random neighbor didn't catch him looking at his wife a second time and took action? The mailman? His wife? Road rage? A stalker? We'll probably never know what happened. But I think that we can all agree that the government is the best and not messy at all. Politicians live to make our lives better, and definitely no corruption exists inside the walls of the White House, and it never has.